Social narratives combine feeling and thinking to construct people's understanding of the political space they inhabit. While they are historically specific to societies, narratives can also emerge through processes that are reproduced across cultures and contexts. Populism generates such processes and requires careful analysis.
Most of the time, research on emotions in populism focuses on irrationality. But irrationality does not explain emotion and, most of all, does not equate with them. Emotion in society and politics need a more nuanced critical approach. Most of the time, research on populism in liberal democracy focuses on deviation. Deviation does not explain populism, does not equate with it. Populism needs a more nuanced and critical approach.
The narrative construction of populism relates to the need for security that exists in society. Populism constructs narratives of trust to displace insecurity. It elaborates a discursive separation between us, understood as the common people, and them, representing a threat or usurpers.
So I'm proposing here that populism would be a heuristic rather than an object of study, moving the attention from one to the other. So instead of studying populism and populisms, we would be using populism theory to think about politics, mobilization, identification, political identification. Us is the basic category of politics, and populism is a particular form of articulating, constituting this us effectively through agonism. So this us building might take a bipolar format and contributing to political polarization, where two sides are co-constituting each other through the mutual opposition of themselves. And when political articulations in a polity end up taking this format, it's actually not a good thing for democracy.
Populism is the expression of social attitudes to confront unfulfilled demands. Different political forces contest the narrative to address social grievances and political behavior. It is therefore important to refine the understanding of populist attitudes towards political ideas within society, because some are more undemocratic than others.
State of the art shows that 3 dimensions used to be highlighted. The first one, the anti-elitism, the second one, the people-centrism, and a third one, the anti-pluralism dimension. That means a kind of homogeneity of the people. And the populist attitude scales are used through the political spectrum. But, and this is our hypothesis, populism is often studied in relation to extremist and exclusionary formations, and this dimension fails to be measured in the previous scales presented on the literature. We propose to the literature the exclusionary populism attitude scales for reinforce 2 dimensions, a measure of anti-pluralism with a stronger cultural dimension and also a measure of chauvinism.
The relevance of the different dimensions of populism and its democratic and anti-democratic perspectives is linked to the history and context in which politics may be conducted. This is embedded in a particular imaginary.
The question about the process of reaffirming traditional or spatial dynamics and the nation-state imaginary. Whereas, although we try to break free from this imaginary and analyzing different scales, it's still there and it possibly will be there for long.
Populism is inherently related to democracy and representation, introducing a balance between the represented and the representatives with the promise of returning political power.
Everyone's supposed to be in a state of equality in democracy. And at the same time, we assume that because we are represented, those who are representing need to take the decisions for us and guide us. And this is not a quite easy balance in democracy. That's the problem of democracy, that we are always shifting from one to another. And populists are quite interesting because they promise to, in the first act, to dissolve this conflict by saying, no, that's the voice of the people, right? The populist leaders are not something we're representing. They are the voice of the people. And this brings them to a promise of more accountability towards those who are representing, but really neglecting the fact that the voice of the people in the leader has no accountability at all. For me, it's interesting to see how this shift occurs, never from one time to another, very clear cut, but in very small steps.
The ability to contest social narratives is rooted in history. Although political forces mobilize from different angles, the imaginary within which they are framed is defined by the legacies of privilege and oppression that have unfolded in the past.
Fighting over their hegemonic resignification either as heroes or perpetrators, right and left-wing populists reify two underlying logics of white nationalism: the essentialization of whites as a transhistorical group and the great man theory of history. Even after representations of white European males were turned into floating signifiers in the aftermath of democratization and decolonization, they still positivize whiteness as essence and sees hetero male heroism as the only form of historical agency. Against, of course, the background of people of color, of blackness. Moreover, when historical narratives are chosen as nodal points in populist formations, they continue to modulate, and this I think it's important that historians give their opinion about this, they continue to modulate the link the community establishes between present, the past, and the future, so historicity or temporality, doing it, in this case, through the agonist lens of populist politics. So what does it mean to look at history in the long duration and see it through these lenses?
If you're a psychologist, you know the term motivated reasoning. I have beliefs, I defend those beliefs, I could call them beliefs, attitudes, values, it doesn't matter. I have a narrative for every situation, every context I'm in, with friends, with colleagues, with work companions, with strangers, with friends. Here's what I am, here's what I believe. And in that case, the mind is not open-minded, it is not designed for accuracy, it is designed for collegiality. Can we share a story that makes us all feel good?
Narratives and the historicity from which they emerge provide the background for the possible existence of the collective imaginary. This includes understanding, feeling, and acting upon social conditions. Emotions motivate people to get involved, influence their behavior, and thus determine their partisan identification processes.
The word emotion is a very modern word. Until emotion was used, it was either passion or sentiment. Emotion as a word comes from the Romance roots, to be in movement. So that's why we are more interested in it, because it actually explains why people are not just moved, but how they act. So emotions play a role, permeate everything. And the difficulties we have is all of us here and all of you are partisans. We're either for this, against that, and I suspect most of us are for the same things, and particularly have a hard time seeing and justifying the emotions that have moved people who hold positions contrary to us.
Emotions provide guidance by shaping how people feel about themselves and society.
My approach to emotions is that apart from everything else that they do, they are signals. They are what we call emotional flashpoints. They give us signals to capture our attention that something in the social, political, economic world needs paying attention to. And usually, as uncomfortable the emotion, same uncomfortable is the truth that comes with it about unequal distribution of resources, opportunities, wealth inequality, marginalization, that is translated or experienced as loss of dignity and humiliation.
Because emotions are shaped by narratives, they draw attention to unsatisfied demands and express a need that can be channeled into societal grievances.
Grievance politics fundamentally deals with what is important to us because it has an emotional undercurrent. And if you take emotions as flashpoints, that's where we start paying attention to what happens when we are aggrieved, when we have a grievance. And our starting point is that grievances are not bad. Grievances, the same way as hot emotions, can turn anti-democratic in certain instances, particularly when they are ignored, and they can turn pro-democratic when their origins and their demands and their needs are addressed. So the big puzzle here is not to do away with grievances, but to try to understand when the pendulum changes or when the train track changes and we go from anti-democratic to pro-democratic, and how we can bridge these two so we can channel them towards pro-social outcomes.
Understanding emotions as processes allows us to reveal the relevance of narrative in populism and politics, which opens up ways of countering undemocratic tendencies with democratic awareness.
Emotions should be studied in a processual way and should be understood in politics also in a processual way. So it's not about fear, but it's kind of fear-making. And it's like be fearing and being fearful about something in some of these communities that is taking place. So it's not just like loving and making this community in some ways. And of course, like this lovingness takes place on the side of the us, trusting takes place among the us, and then there would be these limits to that trust that are also considered, and they can be signified through these negative emotions. Distrust is super important in politics and democracy. I mean, without distrust, you also would not have the political. You need to know when you are trusting something and when you're not.
Oppression and marginalization are socialized within political narratives that influence the sovereignty experienced by social groups and construction of group-based trust within the modern nation-state imaginary. This means that democracy is not a treasure to be discovered, but a social achievement to be constructed.
Treasure is this thing that it will come to us if we're lucky and we find the treasure. Why? Why are we in love with metaphors of that sort that allow us to imagine democracy as something that is out there and we have to discover it by chance and then we are lucky, rather than use a different metaphor that looks at it as a collective achievement for which we have to work for?
The nexus between emotions, narrative, and politics reveals how this interplay affects political behavior and collective decision-making, and thus constitutes the political. Equipped with a critical lens on emotions and narratives in politics, democratic thinking should examine how democracy is repeatedly constructed. This means accounting for how historical, cultural, and social identities are erected and contested, how trust is built or eroded within and between political communities.
But in the political conjuncture we live in, societies seem to perceive emotions differently in narratives, in ways that seem dystopian to a democratic imaginary and produce populist and polarized identities. If passions were, conceived as essential part of politics, since the very beginning of classic political philosophy, but now, in terms of how do we conceive a more kind of complete, less disappointing comprehension, understanding of what is going on amongst humans, this could be kind of interesting to get, but needs to be done in a very multi-perspective.